Welcome in a silent night, a night that takes us back to the 15th century, when a woman cries and no one understands. The woman's name, Margery Kempe. She's not a queen, not a recognized saint, not a writer. He couldn't even read, but he saw something that not everyone can see, and he heard a voice, which not everyone believes. In this story, there is no war, no kingdom collapses, there are no spectacular deaths. There is only constant crying, faint vision, and the woman who seek God between houses, markets, and the wooden floors, wet with his own tears. If you enjoy quiet historical stories that are boring in a touching way and gently lull you to sleep, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment about where you're watching and what time you're watching, because sometimes the saddest stories in history aren't about defeat, but about not being believed. Happy listening, and a good night. The woman wept, and no one understood. The story of Margery Kempe, England, 15th century. She gave birth to a child, and was never the same again. Norfolk, England, circa 1393. One night, in the small town of Lynn, in the county of Norfolk, a woman gave birth to her first child. Her name was Margery, a clothier's wife, not a nobleman, not a nun, just an ordinary woman who lived and cried more often than she laughed. She had endured the pain for hours. The floor smelled of blood and damp wood. Outside, the wind blew through the small, opaque, stained glass window. There weren't enough candles to light the room, and no one knew that that night would change everything. Margery gave birth to a child. The child cried. Margery didn't, because what came out wasn't just a baby, but also something she couldn't understand. A few days later, Margery began hearing voices, voices that weren't from the earth, not from humans, and not from herself. She felt something had broken, or maybe opened. She felt ashamed, afraid, and very lonely. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't stop thinking about fire, about God, about sin. She tried to talk, but no one believed her. They said it was just postpartum fatigue, just a woman's hysteria, just the wind passing through her head. But Margery knew it wasn't just the wind. One night, she struggled, crying, begging her husband to call a priest. She wanted to confess because she felt she had sinned terribly, but she didn't know what her sin was. A priest came, but he was angry. He accused Margery of lying. He couldn't believe what he saw. He couldn't believe that God could come to an ordinary woman. Margery felt like her body was cracking. She fell to the floor. She didn't speak for days. She stopped eating. She stopped being herself. And here, the story begins. Not from victory, not from a miracle, but from a frozen night, from the floor of the delivery room, from tears that fell softly onto the moldy old wood, and from one question that was never answered. Did God really choose a weaver to be his friend? She saw the light, but no one believed. Lynn, England, years after giving birth, but it all felt like one long unfinished day. The distant sound of church bells, a cool breeze in the grass, low, melodious music, drifting like mist. Margery walked into the kitchen. She hadn't eaten since yesterday, or since last week. She wasn't sure herself anymore. Every morning, she woke with a heavy body, but an empty heart. And every night, she closed her eyes, but not to sleep, but to endure. Her husband said, "Why are you so silent?" But Marjorie just stared at the floor, because there she saw something, light, but not candlelight. The light didn't come from the fire, not from the window, not from the sun. She didn't know if it was real or just part of the cracks in her mind. Sometimes as she swept the floor, she felt as if the ground beneath her were opening, and a voice said, "Follow me." But who was speaking? She didn't know. Sometimes the voice was soft, sometimes piercing like a whistle in a silent field. She began to fear, but she was also curious. What did the voice mean? She tried to tell another priest, a younger one, a softer tone, but when she tried to express it, she started crying. Not tears like someone who was sad, but like an unstoppable flood. Her body trembled, her breathing was heavy, and her tears fell, unable to stop them. The priest looked down and said softly, "Marjorie, you're too tired. You need rest. You're not a sinner, just a mother who's exhausted." Marjorie wanted to believe, but something inside her wouldn't calm down. A few days later, in her small room, she heard the voice again, closer, clearer, and this time she saw something in the air, like a human body, but made of light. She felt like her whole body wanted to prostrate, but her legs wouldn't move. She just cried and cried. The voice said, "I've been waiting for you. Why did you hesitate? I was with you, even when they laughed at you." Marjorie tried to answer, but her mouth was dry, and before she could say anything, the light was gone, gone, like a dream that closes the door of morning. In the following days, Marjorie just sat in a corner of the house, staring at the floor. Sometimes she smiled to herself, sometimes she screamed, sometimes she just was silent for hours. People started talking. Her in-laws were ashamed. Her children stayed away. Some neighbors called her possessed. Others called her a failed saint. But no one understood. No one asked, "What did you really see, Marjorie? And what did you want to answer to that voice?" Long pause. Music fades. Rain begins to fall gently. She didn't ask to be seen as a prophet. She didn't ask to be considered holy. She just wanted just one person to believe that she saw the light, and the light called her name. She woke early. She wore travel clothes, a pair of ill-fitting shoes, and a cloth bag containing bread, water, and a small prayer book. She said to her husband, "I want to go to the Holy Land." He stared at her for a long time, silence. Then he nodded. Perhaps he was afraid to argue, or perhaps because he knew his wife couldn't stand the house anymore. Marjorie set off, by ship, by train, sometimes on foot. She walked through the noisy harbor, markets that smelled of fish and blood, and the forest filled only with the sounds of strange birds, and herself. On the ship to Jerusalem, she wept again. People complained. They called her the holy madman. They begged her to be quiet, but Marjorie couldn't, because on that sea, she saw the light again and heard the voice. "Why do you come here? What do you expect from this land?" She didn't know the answer. In Jerusalem, she walked to Golgotha, the place where Jesus was crucified. She felt the ground. Then she fell to her knees. She wept on holy ground, but not because of sadness, but because for the first time, she felt understood by something greater than human. After all that travel, Marjorie returned to Lynn and found her home unchanged, but the people had become strangers than anyone else. They heard she was crying in Jerusalem,
They said she was showing off. They said she was being sanctimonious. They said God wouldn't speak to someone like her. Marjorie tried to be quiet, but her voice never stayed still. The tears kept coming without permission. She was accused of heresy, interrogated by the bishop, accused of speaking directly to Christ, because only a priest could do that, not a weaver's wife, not a woman with a history of trouble. But Marjorie didn't fight back. She only answered quietly that if the voice wasn't from God, why did she feel more at peace after hearing it?
One night, her husband, who had been patient for years, was lying in bed. He called Marjorie. He asked her to sleep together as a husband and wife should. But Marjorie refused. In a quiet voice, she said, "I want to be a virgin again, in soul, in body, and in memory." Her husband wept, but he didn't know what else he could hold onto from a wife whose life was no longer in this house, but on the paths of vision. Finally, they agreed to live together without touching each other again. And from then on, Marjorie felt closer to the light, but further away from anyone else in the world. Marjorie couldn't write. She was illiterate, but she wanted her story recorded. So she hired a scribe, a young monk, who listened to her stories and then wrote them down into a book. It was a long book. It was filled with tears. It was filled with voices not everyone can hear. It was filled with loneliness and hope that someday someone would read this story and to say, "I feel that way too." She didn't die, but she disappeared in silence. Marjorie lived to a ripe old age. She wasn't rich, she wasn't famous, and she was never truly accepted. But she kept going, sometimes to the holy city, sometimes to the monastery, sometimes just to a quiet street where she could cry alone. She kept hearing those voices, even as her years drew to a close. And when she finally left, there was no grand ceremony, no books placed on the shelves of the nobility, just a long note, kept in a corner of the monastery, entitled The Book of Marjorie Kemp. And maybe, tonight, as you listen to this story, Marjorie is still walking on a lonely road that isn't on the map, crying softly, not because she's sad, but because finally there's someone in the 21st century who listens to her story without judgment. If you'd like to continue this long journey, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment, so these stories don't get lost in the hustle and bustle of this fast-paced world. Now, let's sit down with Boethius and hear how philosophy comforts mortals awaiting death. A broken Rome, a chair no longer soft, and a philosopher who wrote silently, waiting to die. He once sat in that chair. He once sat in a cold marble chamber, conversing with kings, deciding cases, signing decrees. He, Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius, a philosopher, a high official, one of the last Latin poets. And now he sat on the stone floor of a prison. His hands were dirty, his paper was wet. The world had changed. He was nothing. And the nights grew long. Boethius was born in Rome, into an old noble family that had once been close to the emperor, the Anici. He was raised with a classical education, logic, rhetoric, Greek, the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. He did not live in Rome's glory, but in the slumber after its fall. He grew up in ruins. He saw power change from Latin to Gothic, from Rome to Ravenna, but he still believed that virtue could guide government. That's why he accepted the position of Magister Officiorum, head of all government affairs, under King Theodoric, an Arian Ostrogothic king who ruled Italy from Ravenna. Boethius still believed in law, in justice, in wisdom, and in words, but now words had deserted him. He sat in prison silently. Outside, Theodoric had already made his decision, and the chair in the palace remained empty. He defended the wrong man, and he paid with his life. His name was Albinus. He was also a senator, also a Roman man who lived in a time when Rome was only a name without power. Albinus was accused of plotting against King Theodoric. The charge, delivering a letter to the Byzantine Emperor, Justinian. But anyone knows, at that time, anything related to Byzantium was considered treason. The Ostrogothic king was suspicious of every whisper from the east. Any sympathy for the Eastern Latin emperor was considered treason. Boethius didn't let it go. He stood before the court. He saw no one in the room brave enough to speak, so he spoke alone. In a calm voice, he said, "If Albinus is guilty, then I am guilty too. If he is guilty of fraternizing with Byzantium, then accuse me too, for I did the same." Silence. No one responded, but the verdict had been rendered. Boethius wasn't defending a friend. He was pleading guilty, and the court was happy to accept that confession, so they arrested him without a fair trial, without time to return home, without a chance to explain. He was taken to an old villa that served as a prison, outside the city, far from spheres of influence, far from anyone who could help. He wasn't defending the wrong, but he lived in a world that didn't want the truth, and the nights grew colder. He never wanted to be an official. He wanted to be a bridge between Plato's world and the real world, between Greek and Latin, between thought and action. He translated Aristotle's works into Latin. He tried to make logic the language of power. He believed that if rulers could think correctly, they could rule correctly. So simple was his belief, so naive. He wrote about the Trinity, about music, about geometry, about how all these things fit together in divine harmony. He wrote because he wanted to bridge the old wisdom with the new world, the Christian world, the Gothic world, the divided world. And in the quiet of his writing room, he dreamed that the world could make sense, that reason and faith, wisdom and the power could coexist, that justice was possible. Little did he know that the world was moving in the opposite direction. He had a wife. Her name was Rusticiana. He was from the Semitius family, also an ancient family, also noble, also Roman. They had 2 sons, and they became officials. But when Boethius was thrown into prison, none of them were allowed to come. Rusticiana pleaded, but they were not allowed. Boethius knew this was more than just punishment. This was severance. He had to be removed from everything, from office, from influence, from writing, from love. He sat alone in a damp stone room. There were only mice, stale air, and the slow movement of time. Sometimes he thought about his children. Were they afraid? Were they ashamed? He didn't know, because all messages were cut off, and all voices had been lost. On the 13th night, he began to speak to himself. His words were not for the guards, not for his wife, not for the world, but for something older, philosophy. And into his empty mind, philosophy came, in the form of an old woman, in torn clothes, but majestic, with eyes full of light and sorrow. She was not real, but not an illusion either. She was a symbol and reality. She was all the books Boethius had ever read, all the wisdom he had ever pursued. Philosophy sat beside him and said quietly, "Why are you weeping? Have you forgotten who you are?" And the Boethius answered, his voice almost gone, "Because I have lost everything." Philosophy did not argue. She simply stared, and the night became a conversation. She spoke of fate, of sorrow, of false prosperity, about the wheel of fortune, which rises and falls without mercy. Philosophy listened, then answered, patiently, long, calmly. They talked about justice, about why the wicked often triumph, about why the good suffer, and philosophy answered, because you think like a mortal. You still want the world to be just as you think it is. But the world is not yours. It is subject to a higher being. Boethius was silent. True happiness, philosophy said, is not power, not wealth, not position, but the goodness within your soul. That is what cannot be taken away. He didn't believe it immediately, but he took notes. And from that silent conversation, a book was born. He knew this was the last night. He heard footsteps. He heard the sound of dripping water, and he didn't write anymore. He just sat. He didn't rebel. He didn't scream. He had become one with the silence. Outside, the king's troops were ready. They brought no decree, only torture instruments. Accounts of the manner of his death vary. Some say he was strangled. Others say his skull was smashed with a wooden club in a quiet room. No ceremony, no burial. And then there was no more sound, but the paper remained, that little book, De Consolatione Philosophiae. It never mentions Jesus, it doesn't quote the Bible, but it remains considered one of the most influential works in Christian thought. It was read in monasteries, translated by Alfred the Great, copied in the Middle Ages, kept in a wooden cabinet for hundreds of years. He died, but his conversation did not. Boethius did not return to that chair. There was no equal successor. The world moved on. Empires fell. Rome rose no more, and knowledge slowly slept. But beneath that sleep, the little book from prison was still read. He never knew that his writings, which he wrote with trembling hands on the cold floor, would outlive kings, and the palaces of Ravenna, now in ruins. Next story, a soldier whose name is not remembered. But before continuing, don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, where you are watching from and what time it is. Western Front, 1916. He wrote letters to his mother every day, but his mother's dead. Nobody read the letter. Nobody buried him. He was lost in the mud and the sound of thumping. It didn't rain, because the rain never stops. It just goes down, slower or more intense, but never stop, never really left, like a feeling of hunger that is never truly full. He had forgotten the last time he saw the sun, or light, or something that isn't mud, or not rotting human flesh, or not himself in the mirror, because there isn't even a mirror here. And he wasn't sure what kind of face he was having today. His name didn't matter, and no one called him. No one called him. Everyone just muttered numbers, commands, curse words, and gestures. Sometimes they pointed, sometimes they grimaced, sometimes they gritted their teeth, but there was no name. He might have had a name once, but now all the calls sounded the same. Shh, hoop, wait, silence, run, get down. That day was like yesterday, and the yesterday was like last week, and the last week was like last year. Time stood still, because there were no clock hands left. They had all been used to stitch wounds or puncture cans, or to mark numbers on the tip of bayonets. He stood in a trench that was chest deep, his feet sunk knee-deep in black mud. Mud that wasn't just soil, but also blood, and the vomit, and the flesh whose owner was unknown, and maybe the remains of people who once laughed. This ditch was like a womb, dark, warm with decay, damp, and too narrow to live, but too deep to escape. In his pocket, there was a wet piece of paper. Every night, he wrote a letter to his mother. Mother, today I am still alive. That was all. Sometimes he added, my feet are swollen, but I can still walk. Or, I got some bread 2 days ago, but now it's gone. Or, I want to go home, but I don't know which way is left. He didn't know that his mother was dead, starving, at home, that hadn't been called home for a long time because the roof had collapsed and the well was dry, and all the letters ever sent ended up in a burned-out metal post office box. The letter would never arrive, but he kept writing, not to be read, not to be sent, but so he knew that he still had a mother, even if it might only be a memory. Sometimes he saw birds, but not doves, not symbols of peace, only vultures, ones that knew exactly when to perch and knew which parts were the softest to eat first. The rifle in his right hand was starting to rust. He couldn't remember the last time he cleaned it, because the water in this ditch was unusable, and the bullets were more important than maintenance, because this weapon wasn't meant to kill, but to survive, or to frighten, or to give him a reason to live another day. His uniform wasn't his anymore. It might have once belonged to someone else. There was someone else's name on the collar, but the letters were gone, torn, and it didn't matter anymore, because here, all bodies were wrapped in cloth, and all the cloth was wrapped in only cold, and the cold was wrapped in only the desire to go home, but no one knew where that home was. He had dreamed of sitting by the stove, holding a hot cup with his mother, or the sound of an old wooden door being opened by the wind. But in this trench, all dreams died first, shot before they could grow, sinking into the ground before they could be spoken. He couldn't feel his feet anymore, not because of the cold, but because of the wounds inside his shoes, and the lingering smell, and the fallen nails, and the skin torn by salt water, and the friction of metal. Every step felt like stabbing his own flesh. But he kept going, because if he stayed still, he would fall. And if he fell, he wouldn't be able to get up again. And if he didn't get up, his body would be stepped over, or trampled on, or ignored like 1,000 other bodies around him. He once tried to count the days by making scratches on the wooden walls of the ditch, 1 line for 1 day, but the wood was wet, and the mud covered everything, and now the lines were all joined together, like a wound that never healed. That night, he stitched the hole in his sock with wire, because the thread was gone, and his fingers were bleeding, but he laughed, because that little pain felt like proof that he was still alive. Suddenly, there was a whistle, a shout, the sound of feet, the sound of metal. Someone said, "Ready." But no one was truly ready. He gripped his rifle. He crouched down, holding her breath. Then, nothing happened. The bullets didn't come. The bombs didn't explode. And they were silent again. Someone laughed softly. Someone cried silently. Someone smoked a cigarette, half eaten by mud. And then she wrote again, "Mother, today I'm still alive, but I don't know for how long."
The ditch never dried, like suffering that never ends, and like names that are never mentioned again, and like her own body that began to disappear slowly, not because of bullets, but because of time and the silence and the rain that never stops. Mother, today I am still alive. She wrote it again with a trembling hand, with wet paper, with ink that was almost gone, with a hope that didn't grow, and with one question constantly swirling in her head. Is anyone still reading? Every night, she took a small piece of paper from her inner pocket. The corners were starting to fray. The edges were black with wetness and mud. Sometimes the paper was dry, sometimes not. It depended on the day. It depended on how much blood she had seen that day. It depended on whether she had cried, or if she couldn't cry anymore. Every night, one sentence, nothing more. Mother, today I am still alive. Sometimes she added, I saw a friend die, but I don't know his name. Or, there was a voice in the distance, but no one came. Or just silence. And the sentence stood alone, without any additions, without explanation. The letter would never arrive, he knew that. But writing wasn't about sending. Writing was the only movement that wouldn't make his body rot faster. The only reason to keep his eyes open tonight. The only thing that could still be called routine. His friends stared at him in surprise. They didn't write. They didn't talk about home. They didn't remember his little brother's name or the names of the streets in the village, because remembering would only hurt deeper, because mentioning would make everything feel more real. And what was real was death. Not going home, he hid the note under his underwear, near his heart, near the part of his body that still felt alive. If he died, he wanted someone to read it, even though he didn't know who it was addressed to, even though he didn't know who wrote it, because there was no name on the letter. He never wrote, from your son. He never wrote, from your son named, because he forgot. Not because he was mad, not because he was shocked, but because too much time had passed in silence. Silence can erase a name. Silence can erode identity. Silence can make you just a body with breath, but no history. One night, he tried to write his own name, to remember, but he only wrote the first letter, and after that, no one came. The letters seemed foreign, like a child's writing, like a memory too distant to touch. He tried to imagine his mother's face. It was faint, hazy, like morning mist, clinging to barbed wire. He only remembered the sound of his mother stirring soup, and the wooden door creaking as it opened, and the smell of burning firewood. That was all. He wrote the letter while listening to the soft snoring of the soldier beside him, and the groans of someone who had just lost a leg, and the whispers of someone reciting a silent prayer, and the beating of his own heart. He heard it like a drum beating from a distance, slowly, uncertainly. He didn't dare stop. That day, he was given a hard biscuit. He didn't eat it straight away. He broke it open a little and tucked the crumbs between the letters he had written. He imagined, maybe if the letter were ever opened one day, the smell of the biscuit would still linger, and the someone maybe would know that he had been hungry, but refused to eat, so he could remember the taste. As someone in the trenches once said, "We write so we don't die now, but we still die later." He didn't fully understand, but he didn't ask, because asking would only open wounds, and the wounds were already too many, even on people he hadn't touched. He didn't know what day it was, or what month, but he knew
that he had written his 47th letter. He knew because he had marked each page with a dot in the bottom right corner, 1 dot for one night, and the pages were already too heavy from being wet, and the dots were bunched together like wounds. He knew the post office was gone, but he still wrapped the letters in scraps of cigarette paper. He tied them with broken shoelaces and kept them under his cracked metal helmet. He didn't want to lose those writings because he didn't want to lose the proof that he had spoken, even if it was only to paper. Sometimes, when the night was very quiet, he reread the letters, not aloud, but with his eyes, slowly, one line at a time. Sometimes he stopped in the middle because he couldn't, because he felt the person who wrote the letters was no longer himself, but someone who had lived, someone who had a mother, and who had known the meaning of home. Someone in that ditch died tonight, a stray bullet, without warning, without a sound. Her body slumped, her eyes open. No one screamed, no one ran, no one said anything. Only one person opened her shirt pocket, took out the letter inside, and put it in her jacket pocket. She looked at it and was silent. Maybe her own letters would be the same, moving from pocket to pocket, never read, without ever knowing who sent them. Then she wrote again, with ink made of mud mixed with rainwater, ink that was barely legible, with fingers bleeding from the previous tear, with eyes half closed, with a heavy chest. Mother, today I am alive, but I don't know if I can write again tomorrow. She folded the paper, stuffed it inside her shirt, closed her eyes, and hoped that morning would come, even if morning only means one more sentence and one night closer to forgetting. He came when the morning was still dark, when the fog hadn't yet lifted, when the mud was still cold like unburied meat. A dog, without a sound, without color, without a name. And no one asked where he came from, because everyone who comes to this place never comes for a reason. He stood at the edge of the ditch, gazing down, his head tilted slightly. His eyes were large, grayish-brown, like the wet earth he walked on every day. He didn't bark, he didn't wag his tail. He wasn't afraid, and he wasn't happy. He just watched, as if to make sure that these muddy humans were still alive. Someone tried to shoo him away. Hush, go away. But he didn't move. He just bowed his head slightly, as if he understood that there was no place worse than here. And because of that, he didn't need to go anywhere. He, the soldier whose name she couldn't remember, watched her from afar, silently, from behind his wet helmet, from behind his sleepless eyes, from behind his breath that was always half-hearted. The dog sat, curled up beside the ditch, near the mound of earth that never dried, where they had laid the last body that couldn't be dragged any further. 2 days later, the dog was still there. He wasn't looking for food. He wasn't digging. He wasn't howling. He wasn't looking for company. He just sat. Sometimes he lay down. Sometimes he scratched at the wounds on his own legs. But most of the time, he was just quiet. Someone finally gave him some leftover broth from a rusty can. He licked it slowly, unhurriedly, as if he knew he didn't have to eat much, because there was no place to be full in this place, because there was no joy waiting after being full. From then on, the dog was never truly far away. Sometimes it disappeared for a moment. Then it reappeared, either from the shadow of a bombed-out tree, or from behind a discarded metal helmet, or from the mist, but it always returned.
always to the same place, always to the side of the trench, a place with no name. The soldier began writing about the dog in his unsent letters. "Mom, there's a dog here. It doesn't speak, but I think it understands." Or, "Mom, the dog sat next to me all night. I didn't feel alone that night." Or simply, "He came again." His friends called it the ghost dog because the dog didn't make a sound, because it appeared and disappeared without a trace, because sometimes the dog was only seen by one person and the others saw nothing, but nothing frightened him. There was no one to chase him away anymore, because his presence was like a small fireplace, warm in an unreasonable way. That night it rained heavily. Someone died, struck by a metal splinter. There was no time to cry, no time to close his eyes, no time to say a name. The body was left on the edge of the ditch, waiting for its turn to be forgotten. The dog sat beside him, without a sound, without movement, just sitting, until morning, until the fog descended again, until the body was half submerged in the mud. In a letter that night, the soldier wrote, "Mother, the dog sat beside the dead body, as if he knew that no one would come again. There was no burial, no ceremony, but perhaps someone was waiting." One afternoon, when the mud had subsided, he cleaned the wound on the dog's paw. With the remaining water it was supposed to drink, with a scrap of cloth from a shirt it no longer wore. The dog didn't resist. It didn't run away. It just stayed still and it closed its eyes. There's a strange calm in a dog's presence. It doesn't demand. It doesn't ask. It doesn't speak. But it doesn't leave either. And in the ditch where everything rots, loyalty is something too rare to ignore. Someone tried to take a picture with a small, smuggled camera, but the result was blurry, just a blurry image of an animal and a person next to it, their face covered in mud. No smile, no pose, just presence. 2 nights later, the dog was gone. No trace, no sound, no scent, no body. The soldier waited, staring at the side of the ditch every morning, looking toward the usual spot, but empty. He wrote, "Mom, the dog didn't come today. I hope he found a drier place, or at least a place not as desolate as here." But a week later, he saw small footprints in the dirt, leading toward a mound at the side of the ditch, and on them, a small bone, not human, maybe leftovers, maybe a sign, maybe just a coincidence. But he stared at it for a long time and wrote, "Mom, he might come back, but not for me. He came to guard. Maybe he's the last dog who still remembers what it means to be with someone." There was no room to sit, no dry floor, no clean place, no chairs, no blankets, just dirt. And the dirt wasn't dirt anymore, but a mixture of things that shouldn't be mentioned. Rainwater, mud, blood, bile, pieces of uniform, ribs, and memories that weren't spoken. So they stood, clung to each other, touching shoulders, in a cold that lingered for too long to be called weather. Because this wasn't weather anymore. This was a state of being. This was the only temperature they knew. They slept standing, with their heads resting on the tip of a bayonet, or on the wooden wall of the trench, or on the body of a friend who was also standing. And sometimes one of them fell, because they had fallen asleep too deeply, because their knees gave out, because their bodies could no longer support themselves. And if he falls, he doesn't get up again, not because he's dead, but because there's no room to stand again. Someone once said, "Sleep is a luxury we can't afford because no land will accept us unconditionally." And everyone nodded, but no one laughed.
because no humor can grow between frozen shoulder blades. In a letter that night, he wrote, "Mother, I slept with my eyes open today, not because I was afraid, but because there was no place to close them." And he closed the letter without a period, because his fingers were stiff, and the ink dried before it could. Sometimes he imagined sleeping on straw, with a wooden ceiling, with a small oil lamp in the corner, with the sound of the fire swishing, with his mother's body sitting in a chair, sewing, or just staring, or even not being there, but still feeling present. But here, there was only the sound of heavy breathing, and the sound of dripping water, and the sound of someone constantly delirious, calling a name that didn't exist, crying in a language they didn't understand, because they came from another land. But tears didn't need translation. One night, someone stood for too long. His body turned to stone, and when touched, he didn't move. They thought he was simply asleep, but it wasn't. He died standing. His eyes were open. His feet were half submerged. His hand still gripped the bayonet handle, and no one lifted him, because there was no room for a burial, and no energy left for the ceremony. He stood beside the body for 2 days, and wrote, "Mother, my friend didn't fall when he died. Perhaps he didn't want to bother anyone." The sentence felt light, but it was also like a wound that had been silently opened. Sleep wasn't like sleep. It was just a partial shutdown of consciousness. The ears still worked. The eyes remained moist. The jaw remained clenched, because sometimes a mouse passed by, sometimes a bullet whistled, sometimes a sudden attack came in one's sleep, and sometimes nightmares are the only solace left, because at least they don't leave a hole in their chest. Some try sleeping with their heads propped up in helmets, but the helmets were full of water, and the water was cold, and the metallic smell made them nauseous. Some slept standing up in wet shoes, and when they woke up, their legs couldn't move because of fungus and wounds, and because their bodies were starting to reject life. He looked up. The sky didn't answer. The sky just blocked out all color. The sky just reflected the sound of gunfire from elsewhere. The sky never gave any certainty. But he kept looking, because if he didn't, he would only see mud, and that was worse than anything. On a night that was too long, he wrote, "Mother, I sleep standing up, like someone waiting for a bus, but the bus never comes, and the rain never stops." He didn't know why he wrote that, but that sentence felt like poetry, even though no one will read it. One day, someone brought a pillow from home, still clean, still smells like soap. But 1 week later, the pillow was gone, stolen, shared, tainted, and finally destroyed, because there's no room here for anything soft. They still sleep standing up, day after day, like sticks stuck half alive, like a clothesline that holds the rest of life, like a gravestone that has not been named. And he, the soldier whose name no one remembers, still stood. He closed his eyes for 5 minutes, then opened them again, then wrote again, then waited, for who knows why. "Mother," he wrote, "they say we'll be turned back. We'll be given a rest, but no one knows when. Maybe by then, we'll have forgotten how to sit." He pressed the letter to his chest and let his body lean against the shade, because tonight, no one slept, but everyone dreamed. A letter for a day that doesn't exist. "Mother, today I imagine spring." That was the first sentence he wrote that day,
after 3 nights without writing, because the rain was too heavy, because his hands were swollen, because he had forgotten how to hope. But that morning, he imagined something that didn't exist. Spring, with dry earth, with the sound of birds, with a blue sky that wasn't burned, with bread that wasn't moldy, and with mother hanging blankets to dry on the wooden fence. There were no seasons here, just cold, and cold, and more cold, sometimes dry, sometimes freezing, but it never changed. Time here wasn't measured by the sun, but by the number of people who hadn't woken up last night, by the number of bullets that had run out, by how quickly meat rotted. But he kept writing. He wrote for a day that wouldn't come, for the next week he wouldn't see, for the letter he would never read, and for the mother who was no longer alive. Mom, I want to come home next summer. I want to replace the roof and dig the well again. He wrote that, not because he believed it, but because it was the only thing that didn't contain blood. In his mind, the house was still standing, even though it wasn't. He knew. He had heard the rumors that his village was burned, that his family was starving, that people had no place to sleep anymore. But he didn't write about it, because if he wrote it, it would be real. And if it were real, everything would collapse. Mom, I dreamed about a potato field. I planted it again in my mind. The sentence didn't make sense, but he wrote it anyway, because the real world had lost its logic. He kept the letter in a small metal box, a spent bullet case, rusty, smelly, but dry enough. The box was already filled with letters like this. Letters for a day that would never come. Letters for a season that would never arrive. Letters for a home that was gone. There was a young soldier reading a letter aloud that night. Not his own. A letter from someone who had died a week ago. The handwriting was neat. The paper was still white. The message was simple. To my son, if you're reading this, your father was still alive when he wrote it. But there was no son, no address, no envelope, and no one was listening. The night was long, but not because of time, because there were no clocks, but because of the unfinished sleeplessness. And the thought of home made everything seem even more distant. He wrote one more letter, letter 61. Mother, when I come home, will the kitchen still be there? Are the stones we baked bread on still there? Is the table Dad made from old wood still intact? She knew the answer to all those questions was no, but she wrote anyway, because writing was the only way to delay destruction. Someone laughed at her that night. Writing is useless. But she didn't answer, because the ones who laugh are usually the first to disappear, and the ones who stay silent, they last the longest. In the bottom corner of the letter, she wrote in small letters, to be read later. But no one would read it, because later never came, and being read no longer mattered, because all that was left here was to survive another hour. She slept that night, hugging her cartridge case, not for protection, but to keep the letters warm, so they wouldn't freeze, so the ink wouldn't crack, so that the words about spring wouldn't break. The letter might be found, maybe not. Maybe it would be burned. Maybe it would be destroyed along with his body, or it would drift away with the mud, or it would end up in a museum, displayed without context. Unknown soldier, 1916, with a footnote. Emotional content, apparently written for his mother. And the people would read it, then move on, then forget. But that night, for him, the letter was real. The letter was home. The letter was the only thing he could create, because his body could no longer create anything.
and the world has ceased to hold meaning. He closed the letter with the words, "I will keep writing until the ink runs out, or until I can no longer open my eyes." Then he folded it slowly, stared at it for a moment, and tucked it under his shirt, close to his chest, close to the heart, close to what's left of him. The sky above the western front never changed. A grayish blue, sometimes cloudy, sometimes empty, but always the same, like a face that refused to show emotion. The sky didn't come down to help. It didn't speak. It didn't blink, and it never gave a hint. The sky simply existed, like a ceiling too high to touch, and too indifferent to be adored. "Mother, I looked up at the sky today," he wrote. "I tried to find your face there, but the sky gave no answer." He wrote the sentence with a nearly worn pencil lead, with ink made from charcoal and ditch water, with swollen fingers. The sky didn't change even though the ground changed every hour. The ground was hollow. The ground was burning. The ground was swallowing bodies. The ground was destroying dreams. But the sky remained silent, as if to say, "I am not responsible for what happens down there." A soldier pointed to a cloud one afternoon. "It looks like a horse," but no one cared, because there was no room for imagination, because the shapes in the sky were inedible, and they couldn't be used to warm feet. The sky was the only thing clean, the only thing untainted, not torn, not full of holes, and that made it feel strange, like a memory too bright to remember. He wrote again, "Mother, I want to sleep under your sky, the warm one, the blue one, the one not filled with the smell of gunpowder." But he knew his mother's sky wouldn't come here, because this place had been abandoned by beautiful things. When someone died that day, they left them lying facing the sky, not for religious reasons, not for tradition, but because it was the only direction that didn't stare at the mud. No one photographed the sky, because no one wanted to take it home. Everyone wanted to forget this place, including the sky. And that night, his letter closed with the words, "Mother, the sky is still above, but I don't know if it's enough." Then he fell asleep, with his head resting on the ground. And an unfinished dream. He wrote his last letter that morning. There was only a drop of ink left, only a sheet of paper left, and his hand was half stiff. "Mother, if I don't write anymore, it doesn't mean I've stopped, but maybe it's because I've arrived." Then he stopped, and didn't write a full stop. The attack came that afternoon, suddenly, without warning, without time to run, just a roar, flying mud, a body lifted, and the world transformed. When the dust settled, he was nowhere to be seen, not among the living, not among the dead, not among the piles of helmets, shoes, bones, rags. No one knew where it had gone. The small box containing the letters was found a few days later, tucked under a wooden plank, still intact, still filled, still cold. The letters were unopened, labeled only unknown, 61 letters, no name. They were sent to a warehouse, then to an archive, then to a vault, then forgotten. And when the war was over, the letters remained unread. No one looked. No one recognized the handwriting. No one asked, because the world was busy with peace treaties and rebuilding. But one day, years later, someone read them. A young archivist, alone, in a quiet room. She read the first sentence, "Mother, today I am still alive." And then she wept, not because of the letter's content, but because no one had ever replied. She retyped all the letters, titled "A Soldier Whose Name No One Remembers,"
published them secretly, and wrote on the last page. Maybe he doesn't need to be remembered, but he wrote, and that's enough. That's how he came back to life, in letters, in unfinished sentences, in pauses too long to explain, and in voices read aloud when others couldn't sleep. He never had a tombstone, never had a ceremony, no birth date, no death date. But now, every time someone reads that letter in the silence of the night, he breathes again, slowly, quietly, and lonely, in a form that history cannot explain. The end, but not finished, because the letter hasn't been answered. And maybe it never will be. Thank you for listening to this untold story about a soldier whose name is unknown, who keeps writing even though no one reads, who keeps hoping even though he doesn't know who that hope is for. If you listen to this tonight and feel a little quieter, or a little more peaceful, or maybe just quiet, that's enough. Because sometimes what we need isn't an answer, but just someone who still wants to read, sitting in the dark, without rushing. If you want to keep hearing stories like this, that aren't fast, aren't loud, and aren't meant to be rushed, you can subscribe to this channel. Take it slow, no pressure. Only if you want. And if you like it, you can hit like or leave a small comment telling me where you're from and what time it is. It helps us so that stories like this don't just fade away. We'll meet again in another story from forgotten people who once lived and once waited for letters that never came. Good night, and may you sleep peacefully.